A group of 5 college friends disappeared without a trace during what should have been a simple weekend camping trip in the dense forests of northern Michigan, leaving behind only their abandoned car and a mystery that would haunt their families for 4 long years. When a seasoned bow hunter stumbled upon 2 weathered tents, hidden deep in an area no recreational camper would ever venture, he discovered something inside that would finally break the silence of the woods and reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The fluorescent lights of the campus library cast harsh shadows across Maya Chen's textbooks as she glanced at her phone for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. It was 11:47 p.m. on October 13, 2011, and her study group should have been back from their weekend camping trip hours ago. Outside the tall windows, the first real cold snap of autumn had settled over the University of Michigan campus, turning the air sharp and brittle. Maya had opted out of the trip to focus on her organic chemistry midterm, a decision that now felt like a cruel twist of fate as worry gnawed at her stomach like acid. The group had left Friday afternoon in high spirits, piling into Garrett Sullivan's beat-up Honda Pilot with enough gear for what they'd planned as a simple 2-night camping adventure in the Huron National Forest. Garrett, a senior from Detroit with an infectious laugh and an obsession with outdoor photography, had been planning this trip for weeks. He'd convinced his girlfriend Zoe Blackwood, a quiet art major with paint-stained fingers and a surprising love for hiking, to join him along with their 3 closest friends. There was Camden Torres, a pre-med student whose nervous energy made him talk too fast, but whose loyalty ran deeper than Lake Superior. Beside him sat Iris Novak, a journalism major with sharp green eyes and an even sharper wit, who documented everything with her ever-present digital camera. The 5th member of their tight-knit group was Beckett Hayes, a computer science major whose dry humor and encyclopedic knowledge of survival shows had earned him the nickname Bear after Bear Grylls. They were supposed to return by Sunday evening, October 16th, with classes resuming Monday morning. Maya had expected a flood of photos on Facebook, stories about Garrett's latest photography obsession, and probably complaints from Camden about sleeping on the ground. Instead, there was only silence. Their phones had gone straight to voicemail since Saturday morning, which wasn't entirely unusual given the spotty cell coverage in the National Forest. But as Sunday night stretched into Monday morning with no word, Maya's concern crystallized into genuine fear. She wasn't the only one worried. By Monday afternoon, when none of the 5 had shown up for classes, their absence had been noticed by professors and friends alike. Garrett's photography professor mentioned his uncharacteristic absence to the department head. Zoe's roommate called her parents when she didn't return to their dorm. Camden's study partner for their MCAT prep course grew concerned when he missed their scheduled session. The worry spread like ripples across campus, connecting friends, roommates, and faculty in a growing web of unease. The official missing persons report was filed Tuesday morning when Garrett's parents drove up from Detroit after receiving frantic calls from multiple sources. The Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department took the report seriously, especially given that 5 responsible college students had vanished simultaneously. The initial investigation was straightforward and methodical. They traced the group's last known location to a gas station in Grayling, Michigan, where security footage showed all 5 friends laughing and buying snacks around 3:30 p.m. on Friday, October 14th. The timestamp on Iris's last Instagram post, a photo of towering pine trees with the caption "Into the Wild We Go," was 4:17 p.m. that same day. The search began in earnest Wednesday morning. Garrett's Honda Pilot was located within hours, parked at a popular trailhead about 15 miles northeast of Grayling. The vehicle was unlocked, keys still in the ignition with the friends' wallets, phones, and identification left behind in a neat pile on the dashboard. It was as if they had intentionally shed their connections to the outside world before walking into the forest. Their camping gear was gone, along with their backpacks and the food they'd purchased at the gas station. The scene suggested a planned departure rather than foul play, but the deliberate abandonment of their phones and identification struck investigators as deeply unusual. The initial search focused on the established trail system radiating out from the parking area. Teams of volunteers, including fellow students who had driven up from Ann Arbor, combed through miles of marked paths, Search and rescue dogs picked up scent trails that led into the forest, but seemed to dissipate after a few hundred yards, as if the group had simply evaporated into the dense canopy of oak, maple, and pine. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept overhead, their mechanical drone echoing through valleys that had swallowed 5 young lives without leaving so much as a footprint in return. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded beyond the immediate trail system into the vast wilderness of the Huron National Forest. This was not the manicured, user-friendly outdoors of state parks, but genuine backcountry, a sprawling maze of unmarked deer paths, seasonal streams, and dense undergrowth that could hide secrets for decades. The terrain that swallowed the 5 friends was unforgiving in ways that casual hikers rarely understood. The Huron National Forest stretched across nearly 1 million acres of northern Michigan, a vast wilderness where experienced outdoorsmen could lose their bearings within minutes of leaving marked trails. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of fallen logs, hidden sinkholes, and seasonal wetlands that could shift from solid ground to knee-deep muck without warning. Ancient glacial activity had carved the landscape into a confusing network of ridges and valleys, creating natural dead zones where cell phone signals died and GPS devices became unreliable. It was the kind of place where a wrong turn could lead to days of wandering in circles, where the dense canopy blocked out the sun's directional guidance and where the sound of civilization was swallowed by an oppressive green silence. Detective Sarah Whitmore of the Michigan State Police had seen missing person cases before, but the complete disappearance of 5 people simultaneously was unprecedented in her 15-year career. A methodical woman with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing, Whitmore approached the case with the systematic thoroughness that had made her one of the state's most respected investigators. She established a command post at the Grayling Fire Station and coordinated with multiple agencies, including the National Park Service, local sheriff's departments, and volunteer search and rescue organizations from across the state. The investigation consumed resources at an alarming rate, with search teams working 12-hour shifts and helicopters burning through thousands of dollars in fuel costs daily. By the end of the first month, the official search had covered over 200 square miles of forest. Volunteers had walked grid patterns through swamps, climbed rocky outcroppings, and rappelled into ravines deep enough to hide a small building. They found deer carcasses, abandoned hunting blinds from decades past, and the rusted remains of a 1970s pickup truck that had apparently been driven into the woods and forgotten. But of Garrett, Zoe, Camden, Iris, and Beckett, there was no trace. The forest had accepted them completely, leaving behind only questions and the growing weight of families' grief. The media attention was intense but brief. Local news stations covered the story for weeks, featuring tearful interviews with parents and friends who pleaded for information. The case made national headlines when a popular true crime podcast dedicated an episode to the disappearance, speculating about everything from cult activity to alien abduction. Social media buzzed with amateur theories and supposed sightings that led nowhere. But as winter approached, and the search was officially suspended due to dangerous weather conditions, public interest waned. The 5 friends became another unsolved mystery, their missing person posters fading on community bulletin boards as newer tragedies claimed attention. For the families, however, the nightmare was just beginning. Garrett's parents, both teachers from a working-class Detroit neighborhood, exhausted their savings hiring private investigators and psychics. They spent weekends driving to the forest, walking the same trails over and over, calling their son's name into the indifferent wilderness. Zoe's mother, a single parent who had worked double shifts as a nurse to put her daughter through college, took a leave of absence that stretched into permanent disability as depression consumed her. Camden's large extended family organized their own search parties, bringing dozens of relatives from across the Midwest to comb through areas the official search had missed. Iris's parents, both journalists themselves, used their media connections to keep the story alive, appearing on talk shows and maintaining a website dedicated to finding their daughter. Beckett's family, devastated by the loss of their only child, retreated into themselves, unable to cope with the constant uncertainty. The case officially went cold in the spring of 2012, filed away in Detective Whitmore's growing collection of unsolved disappearances. She never stopped thinking about the 5 friends, though. Their photographs remained pinned to her office wall. 5 young faces frozen in time, smiling at cameras they would never see again. She continued to follow up on tips that trickled in sporadically, driving out to investigate reported sightings that invariably turned out to be other hikers or wishful thinking. The case haunted her in a way that few others had, perhaps because of the complete absence of evidence, the way 5 people had simply stepped out of existence as if they had never been born. As years passed, the families learned to live with the peculiar torture of ambiguous loss. They couldn't grieve properly because there were no bodies, no closure, no definitive end to hope. Garrett's parents kept his room exactly as he had left it, his camera equipment gathering dust on the desk where he had planned his final photography expedition. Zoe's mother continued to pay her daughter's cell phone bill, unable to bear the thought of disconnecting the number. Camden's family held a memorial service on the 3rd anniversary of the disappearance, but it felt hollow without remains to bury. Iris's parents published a book about their daughter's disappearance, donating the proceeds to missing person organizations. Beckett's family moved away from Michigan entirely, unable to live in a state that had swallowed their son. The forest itself seemed to mock their grief. Seasons changed, leaves fell and regrew, snow covered and melted away, but the Huron National Forest kept its secrets. Other hikers continued to use the trails, other families enjoyed camping trips, other college students took weekend adventures. Life moved on around the absence of 5 young people who had simply walked into the woods and never walked out. The case files grew thicker with false leads and dead ends, but the central mystery remained as impenetrable as the day it began. Detective Whitmore retired in 2014, but she never stopped carrying the weight of the unsolved case. She had investigated murders, kidnappings, and every variety of human cruelty, but the disappearance of the 5 friends remained her greatest professional failure. In her final report, she wrote that the case represented either the most perfectly executed crime in Michigan history or the most tragic accident, but she could never determine which. The forest had claimed 5 lives and left behind only silence, a testament to the vast indifference of the natural world to human hopes and dreams. The years that followed were marked by the slow, painful process of families learning to exist in a world where their children had simply vanished. Maya Chen, the friend who had stayed behind to study, carried a burden of survivor's guilt that shaped every decision she made. She changed her major from chemistry to criminal justice, driven by a need to understand how 5 people could disappear so completely. She graduated with honors but never felt the satisfaction she had expected, knowing that her closest friends would never share in her achievements. Every October 13th, she made the drive to Grayling, standing at the trailhead where their car had been found, whispering apologies to the wind for not going with them, for not somehow preventing their fate. The case had ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate families. The University of Michigan implemented new policies requiring students to register outdoor activities with campus safety. The Huron National Forest increased ranger patrols and installed emergency communication stations at major trailheads. Local search and rescue organizations received additional funding and training, preparing for future disappearances that everyone hoped would never come. But these measures felt like closing the barn door after the horses had escaped, practical responses to a tragedy that defied practical explanation. Detective Whitmore's replacement, a younger investigator named Marcus Reed, inherited the cold case files with a mixture of determination and dread. Reed had grown up in northern Michigan and knew the forest intimately, having hunted and fished its depths since childhood. He understood better than most how the wilderness could swallow people whole, but the complete absence of evidence in this case troubled him deeply. He spent his first year on the job re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, and walking the same trails that had been searched dozens of times before. Like his predecessor, he found nothing but questions. The breakthrough that would finally crack the case came from an unexpected source, a man who had no connection to the investigation and no knowledge of the 5 missing students. Dale Kruger was a 58-year-old machinist from Saginaw who had been bow hunting in the Huron National Forest for over 30 years. A quiet, methodical man with weathered hands and the patience of someone who understood that the best things in life required waiting, Kruger knew the forest's rhythms better than most park rangers. He hunted alone, preferring the solitude of the deep woods to the social aspects of hunting camps. His knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic, accumulated through decades of pre-dawn hikes to remote tree stands and careful observation of animal patterns. On the morning of November 8, 2015, Kruger was tracking a wounded deer through a section of forest he had never explored before. The 8-point buck had taken his arrow poorly, requiring a careful blood trail that led him deeper into the wilderness than he typically ventured. The terrain was challenging even for someone of his experience, a maze of fallen trees and rocky outcroppings that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. He had been following the sparse blood trail for over 2 hours when he realized he was completely lost, something that had not happened to him in decades of hunting. The area where Kruger found himself was a natural depression surrounded by steep ridges, a hidden valley that was invisible from any established trail or vantage point. Ancient pines towered overhead, their canopy so dense that even in November, with most deciduous trees bare, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of his boots on a carpet of pine needles that seemed to muffle all sound. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by human presence, a pocket of wilderness that existed outside of time and civilization. It was in this hidden valley that Kruger spotted the first tent. At first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The fabric was so faded and weathered that it blended almost perfectly with the surrounding vegetation, like camouflage that had been designed by nature itself. Only the geometric lines of the tent's structure, too regular to be natural, gave it away. As he approached cautiously, his hunter's instincts alert for any sign of danger, he realized he was looking at a campsite that had been abandoned for years. The tent was a high-quality dome model, the kind serious backpackers used for extended wilderness trips. But time and weather had taken their toll. The bright blue fabric had faded to a dull gray-green, and several panels showed tears that had been inexpertly patched with duct tape. The zippers were corroded, and the aluminum poles were bent in places, suggesting the tent had weathered severe storms. Pine needles and debris had accumulated around the base, and small saplings had begun growing through gaps in the fabric. It was clear that this tent had been here for years, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a fallen log, Kruger discovered the second tent. This one was in even worse condition, its red fabric so sun-bleached and torn that it barely held its shape. The rainfly had partially collapsed, creating a depression that had filled with years of accumulated leaves and organic matter. Both tents were positioned in a small clearing that would have been invisible from any direction except ground level, a natural campsite that offered protection from wind and some concealment from the elements. Kruger's first instinct was to investigate further, but something about the scene made him hesitate. There was an atmosphere of abandonment that went beyond simple neglect, a sense that something terrible had happened in this hidden valley. The silence seemed oppressive, and even the usual forest sounds of birds and small animals were absent. His hunting experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him to leave this place undisturbed and report what he had found to the authorities. Using his GPS unit, Kruger carefully marked the coordinates of the campsite before beginning the difficult journey back to his truck. The terrain that had seemed merely challenging on the way in now felt actively hostile, as if the forest itself was trying to prevent him from leaving with his discovery. It took him over 3 hours to find his way back to the nearest trail, and by the time he reached his vehicle, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping rapidly. That evening, Kruger sat in his small hunting cabin, staring at the GPS coordinates he had written on a scrap of paper. The numbers seemed to burn into his consciousness as he tried to process what he had discovered. He was not a man given to flights of imagination, but there had been something profoundly unsettling about those abandoned tents, something that went beyond their obvious age and deterioration. The complete absence of any other camping gear, The way the forest seemed to have grown around them rather than simply over them, and most disturbing of all, the sense that he was not the first person to stumble upon this hidden valley in recent years. The next morning, Kruger drove to the Michigan State Police post in Grayling and asked to speak with someone about a discovery he had made in the forest. The desk sergeant, a young trooper named Williams who had only been on the job for 6 months, initially seemed skeptical of the grizzled hunter's story. Abandoned campsites were not uncommon in the national forest, and most turned out to be nothing more than the detritus of irresponsible campers who had left their gear behind. But something in Kruger's demeanor, the careful way he described the location, and his obvious reluctance to have gotten involved at all, convinced Williams to take the report seriously. Detective Reed received the call while reviewing case files at his desk, the same files that had consumed his predecessor's final years. When Williams described Kruger's discovery, Reed felt a familiar mixture of hope and skepticism that had become his default response to potential leads in cold cases. He had investigated dozens of abandoned campsites over the years, each one raising the possibility of a breakthrough that never materialized. But the location Kruger described was intriguing, an area so remote that it had never been included in any of the official search grids. Reed met with Kruger that afternoon, spreading topographical maps across the conference table and asking the hunter to pinpoint the exact location of his discovery. Kruger's weathered finger traced a path through the map's contour lines, following the route he had taken while tracking the wounded deer. The coordinates he provided placed the campsite in a natural depression nearly 8 miles from the nearest established trail, in terrain so difficult that it would have required expert navigation skills to reach intentionally. The detective studied the map with growing excitement. The location was consistent with one of the theoretical search areas that had been identified in 2011 but never thoroughly explored due to its remoteness and the dangerous terrain required to reach it. If someone had been trying to hide a campsite from searchers, this hidden valley would have been nearly perfect. It was invisible from the air, inaccessible to vehicles, and far enough from any trail that casual hikers would never stumble upon it. Reed assembled a small team for the expedition, including a crime scene technician, a search and rescue specialist, and Kruger himself as a guide. They set out before dawn on November 12th, carrying specialized equipment for documenting and preserving any evidence they might find. The hike to the hidden valley took over 4 hours, following game trails and creek beds through terrain that seemed designed to discourage human passage. By the time they reached the coordinates Kruger had provided, all 4 men were exhausted and scratched from pushing through dense undergrowth. The campsite was exactly as Kruger had described it, 2 weathered tents positioned in a small clearing that felt like a secret room carved out of the forest. But what struck Reed immediately was not just the age of the equipment, but the deliberate nature of the camp's placement. This was not a random spot chosen by lost hikers, but a carefully selected location that offered maximum concealment and protection. Someone had known exactly what they were doing when they established this camp. The crime scene technician began photographing everything before anyone touched the tents or disturbed the surrounding area. The documentation process was painstaking, capturing every angle and detail of the scene. The tents themselves were partially collapsed but still structurally intact, their guy lines secured to trees with knots that spoke of camping experience. Between the 2 tents, the remains of a fire ring were visible, stones arranged in a careful circle with charcoal and ash still visible beneath years of accumulated debris. When Reed finally unzipped the first tent, the blue one that Kruger had initially spotted, he found himself looking into a time capsule from 2011. Inside, protected from the worst of the weather by the tent's deteriorating fabric, were the personal belongings of people who had vanished 4 years earlier. Sleeping bags, still in their stuff sacks, were arranged along the tent's perimeter. A small camp stove sat in one corner, its fuel canister long since empty. Most significantly, scattered across the tent floor were items that made Reed's pulse quicken with recognition. A digital camera, its LCD screen cracked, but the body intact, lay next to a journal with a distinctive purple cover. A University of Michigan sweatshirt, faded but unmistakably bearing the school's logo, was wadded up near the tent's entrance. A pair of hiking boots, women's size 7, sat neatly arranged as if their owner had just stepped out of them. Each item was like a piece of a puzzle that Reed had been trying to solve for years, physical evidence that the 5 missing students had indeed made it to this remote location. The second tent yielded even more compelling evidence. Inside, Reed found a backpack with a luggage tag that bore the name Camden Torres in careful handwriting, a prescription bottle with Iris Novak's name, and a date from October 2011 sat next to a paperback novel with Beckett Hayes written on the inside cover. Most heartbreaking of all was a small digital video camera, its memory card potentially containing the last images recorded by the missing students. But it was what Reed didn't find that troubled him most deeply. There were no human remains in either tent, no clothing that suggested the students had died in this location, no signs of violence or struggle. The camp appeared to have been abandoned deliberately, as if its occupants had simply walked away one day and never returned. The absence of the students themselves raised new questions that were even more disturbing than the original mystery of their disappearance. As the team continued their methodical search of the campsite, they discovered additional evidence that painted a picture of an extended stay in the wilderness. A makeshift latrine had been dug behind a large boulder, showing that the students had planned for a longer camping trip than anyone had realized. Food wrappers and empty cans, carefully buried in a shallow pit, suggested they had rationed their supplies over several days or possibly weeks. The most chilling discovery came when the crime scene technician processed the digital camera's memory card back at the lab. The final photos, time-stamped October 19, 2011, showed the 5 friends very much alive but clearly in distress. Garrett's usually bright smile was replaced by a gaunt, hollow expression. Zoe appeared thin and exhausted, her artistic confidence replaced by obvious fear. Camden, Iris, and Beckett huddled together in one frame, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of people who had been surviving in the wilderness far longer than planned. The last video, recorded by Iris with shaking hands, revealed the truth that had eluded investigators for 4 years. Her voice, barely above a whisper, spoke directly to the camera. "It's been 12 days since we got lost. We found this place by accident, but we can't find our way back. Camden hurt his leg badly 3 days ago. We're running out of food. If someone finds this, tell our families we tried to make it home." The video showed Camden lying in the blue tent, his right leg clearly broken and crudely splinted with tent poles and duct tape. The group had been trapped in the hidden valley, unable to navigate the treacherous terrain with an injured member. Their careful rationing had extended their supplies, but not indefinitely. The final entry in Iris's journal, dated October 21st, contained a heartbreaking decision. "We're going to try to carry Camden out tomorrow. We can't wait any longer. If we don't make it, at least we'll be together." Detective Reed stood in the valley where the tents had been found, now empty and silent once again. The evidence suggested the 5 friends had attempted to carry their injured companion through the unforgiving wilderness, a desperate gamble that had likely cost all their lives. Their remains were probably scattered somewhere in the vast forest, claimed by animals and weather, but their story had finally been told. The families finally had their answers, though the truth brought little comfort. The 5 friends had not died immediately, but had survived for weeks in conditions that would have broken most people. They had faced their fate together, with courage and loyalty that spoke to the strength of their friendship. The forest had kept their secret for 4 years, but it could not keep it forever. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more mysterious disappearances that finally found their resolution. Sometimes the wilderness gives up its secrets, but only to those persistent enough to keep looking.